Hi, budget is going to come up very soon, or in case you watch this video after the budget will have probably been already released. While a lot of you who are preparing for your MBA interviews will be thinking like, what are the things to study in budget? What are the levels of competence which I need to reach in order to succeed in an interview? What we thought was we'll look at a simple terminology which will probably help you understand the complexities of budget as well as the macroeconomic situation in the country. Now, a lot of you may not have a grounding on macroeconomics, so I'll try to be as simple as possible in terms of the terminologies which are used and what are the effects and causes of the problems which are there. Now, this video we will look at just one terminology, one term, which is basically the fiscal deficit in a budget, and see how it is related to all the other areas in the budget preparation, macroeconomics, all the problems that we are facing, and all the solutions that a lot of economists will be throwing around, all the fund managers will be telling these other things to do, all the wish lists which you will be getting for the budget, and so on. Before I start this video, in case you like this video, please do share it with your friends who are preparing for CAT and other MBA entrance examination. Please do subscribe to this channel if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're watching this on Facebook, please do like our page and follow it so that you get notifications for all the future events. Let's get on. So what exactly is fiscal deficit? In simple terms, fiscal deficit is the profit which is made by the country. Okay, so it is the total income less the total expenses. Now, if the expenses goes beyond the income which is received by the government, then it becomes a deficit. If you have incomes or revenues which are received by the government is more than the expenses which the government is has to incur, then it becomes a surplus. Countries do create a surplus. There are a lot of times when developed countries have created surpluses in their budget, or they declare a surplus in their budget. For example, the US in the 1990s, through the Clinton era and just before George W. Bush, the junior one took over, US was running surpluses. Okay, but it's very rare. Most of the developed countries as well as developing countries, they end up running deficits. The problem is the size of the deficit. Fiscal deficit is usually measured as a percentage of the GDP. Now, in our country, politicians have this habit of giving everything free, right? I mean, you will see a lot of the southern politicians basically promise 2 rupee rice, free electricity, free water, free bus rides, free internet, free laptop, all those things. Now, that has to be funded by somebody. Where does the money come from? The money comes from the government, right? So government has, because government is spending on all that, you might have to raise taxes to get all those money, etc. But eventually, many a times, in order to make sure that they stay in power, most governments run a deficit also. Now, this deficit is usually pegged as a percentage of GDP. Now, because India's budget deficit or fiscal deficit problem is pretty massive, right? And a lot of states are also responsible for spending, without any eye on the future, right? What the government did was in 2003, right, during the time of the Vajpayee government, they enacted what is called the FRBM. It's the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Bill, an act, right, which tried to curb the deficits which a government can run, right? And in 2016, the target for the 2020 budget was basically 3% of GDP. So your your fiscal deficit cannot exceed 3% of your GDP. That was the target which is given to us. Now, while this is a target which is most governments have been fiscally prudent, sometimes what happens is that because of either extraordinary circumstances or because of probably malintentions, you exceed that target. I mean, you may not be able to curb your expenses to only 3% of your GDP, right? In that case, the the government basically relaxes that particular target. So there is some leeway over there. Key point was during the 2008 financial crisis, the Manmohan Singh government actually relaxed that budgetary target so that you can, you know, India can support its banks and spend on schemes like Manrega schemes, etc. Right. So while that's a very nice number to have, if you concentrate only on that number, there will be a lot of problems which you might face. And one of the criticisms of this particular government is that it is just concentrating on that number. And we discussed this in one of our previous sessions also, which was on agriculture and onion pricing. This current government is actually fudging its fiscal deficit number to the extent of understating it by almost 60% or only 50%, which means like almost whatever it shows is the fiscal deficit, almost that much amount is actually hidden. And this was given out by the CAG report, which came up in 2018, that India's fiscal deficit was actually hidden during various cases. Now, let me tell you how fiscal deficit, what contributes to the fiscal deficit, and how the government is hiding it, and what are the problems it faces because of a fiscal deficit. Now, as I discussed earlier, fiscal deficit is basically like an operating profit for a country, right? So whatever the incomes income that the government receives, less the expenses that the government has to pay out, whatever is the difference, if it is positive, it is a surplus, if it is negative, it is a deficit. Now, what will be the income for a government? The income for the government will be your taxes, right? Besides the taxes, you also have a lot of additional income sources. Like, for example, government has investment in a lot of public sector companies. Like, for example, you have Oil India, all those oil marketing companies, telecom companies, banks like State Bank of India, financial institutions like LIC, etc. So the government, because it's a shareholder, it can get a dividend from these companies. So this is your usual income sources, right? And if government has lent to somebody and it's collecting interest on that, that is also a profit or income for the government. Besides these incomes, the government can also get some extraordinary incomes or like one-time income. For example, if the government sells a share in a particular company, then you get money that comes to the government. You would have heard of the huge noise which was made when RBI transferred a lot of money as an extraordinary dividend or a one-time payment to the government after the last budget. Again, that's an extraordinary income. You don't expect it to get every single year. RBI does pay some amount of dividend, but there is an extraordinary transfer also, which helps the government get some income. What are there on the expenses side? The expenses side are basically all the subsidies which are given to the poor, the salaries which are paid to all the government employees. Government of India also borrows a lot from the market, and as a result of which, any interest which has to be paid on those borrowings are basically your expenses which the government has to meet, right? Besides that, any schemes that the government launches, all those things are also expenses. You have all these transfers on direct benefit transfers, like you have PM Kisan, you have Manrega schemes. All those expenses are there for the government. And if there are any new launches, like for example, you're giving subsidy on power, subsidy on electricity, subsidy on fertilizers, all those are also payments which are made by the government. So those are your general expenses. So the difference is income minus expense is your fiscal deficit. Now, in a usual scenario, if the economy is doing reasonably well, any expenses that you spend will be expected to give you, returns in the future. For example, if you give the poor a lot of money to spend, they will end up spending money in buying goods. Because goods are being sold, you will have companies reporting profits, and even on the sales you are going to collect GST, on the profits you are going to collect your corporate tax. People are employed, so they are going to pay personal income tax. Economy is doing well, so usually you are able to keep the budget deficit within control. Now, when the economy starts faltering because of either an external event like a war or because there's a cyclical event like your economy is going through a cyclical downturn, or there is a large scale unemployment or a shock, right? The numbers will not match. Your expenses most of the time remain constant. I mean, you cannot fire people. I mean, the government jobs are supposed to be one of the safest jobs, so you cannot fire people. Those salaries have to be paid. You have borrowed money from banks. You have to meet those payments. So your interest payments remain fixed. You cannot withdraw benefit schemes from the poor. Going to be a huge political problem. So your expenses remain virtually the same. You can probably stop spending or launching new schemes, but all the existing expenses, it's a little difficult to cut, right? So that's why you would see all the new news where the government is saying, like, asking the bureaucrats to use only 3 or 4-star hotels instead of 5-star hotels, or travel in economy class instead of first class. Travel in, don't stay in a particular place, come back on the same day. There's no need for using the guest houses or any of those things. So those are your expense cutting measures, but largely it's pretty difficult to cut those expenses. So on the other side, your incomes are directly related to how your economy is doing. So if your GDP is falling down, you will not collect a lot of indirect taxes. I mean, GDP is basically a measure of all the incomes from all the goods and services, or output from all the goods and services in the economy. So if your industrial output is falling, your GDP is not growing at the same rate as you thought, you are not going to get the same amount of taxes in terms of money, right? So your income minus expenses, that gap basically keeps on increasing. Now, how can a government plug this gap? And that is one of the reasons why this government has been criticized on fudging the numbers. Let me tell you beforehand, the previous governments have also done it. I mean, under Mr. P. Chidambaram, who was the finance minister, they also used some of the tactics which this government is using. Only thing is the scale. So if earlier the difference was about 4,000 or 5,000 crores, now the difference is about 1 lakh crore or something like that. So it's a scale which is a problem right now. That's the reason why people are saying that only about 40 to 50% of the deficit is actually being captured. The rest are all kept away in some other ways. Now let's see how the government can avoid this deficit. Now the first tactic that a lot of people, I mean even you might be using, is if somebody asks you to pay, you say that I will pay later. Right? Now, because there is a financial year and financial year ends in 31st of March, right? Any payment that you make at the, if you can avoid paying somebody after till 31st of March, it will not be reflected as expenses in this particular year. It will come as an expense to the future year. It's a problem in the sense like you still have to make the payment next year, but this year you are safe, right? So I am safe for this year. I will probably pay you the next time. So you would have also done it like, boss, I don't have enough money. I'll pay you at the end of the month when I actually get my salary. A lot of us have done it. Now, when the government does it, there's a problem. What is the problem? Because the government is also responsible for making payments to a lot of states. For example, government collects the GST is collected centrally, and then the government gives a share to the states, right? Because it is cleared in that way, if the government stops paying the states, the individual states like UP, Maharashtra, Bihar, etc., if it does not give the revenues that's collected from GST to the states, then the problem is that the states cannot implement their schemes. There are a lot of schemes which are at the state level also, right? So those schemes cannot be implemented. They cannot pay the salaries to their employees as well. So it becomes a cascading effect, so to speak. Besides the GST part, the government also has to give a part of the income tax collected to the states as well. If government starts deferring that also, again it becomes a problem. The state projects become a problem. You will not have people who are hired on a contract basis. Your state level employment schemes go for a toss. Basically, it becomes a problem. So deferring your money is one part. You basically will you basically say that I will pay you later. That is the first way that the government can avoid doing this. Now, why is, ideally speaking, if your accounting basis is proper, right? Even companies do the same thing. There are a lot of companies which basically say that I will pay you in the next basis, but they recognize it on their balance sheet, right? Unfortunately, the accounting that the government of India does is basically on a cash basis, which is as of that day. So if the money comes in, it is accounted. If the money goes out, it is accounted. So that leads a lot of problem for fudging the accounts. Not okay, you can call it fudging or creatively managing the accounts. That's why, because this expense is not recognized, right? Tomorrow you know that the next year on April 1st, again, this is due. The amount which you're deferring is due. Unfortunately, you're saved for this year, so it gives an incentive for a lot of finance ministers to play around with this number. So they will delay the payments. That's the first tactic that a lot of people use. Previous government also used it. This government has also done it. Now, what is the second thing which you do? If you are supposed to make a payment, right, you don't have enough money, right? So the second thing which you'll do is, suppose you have lent some money to some of your friends, you will start asking them for money, right? Say that, boss, give me the money because I also need to make the payment. So how does it transfer on a government basis? On a government basis, how this works is, because the government has shares in a lot of these public sector companies, like for example State Bank of India, Indian Oil Corporation, ONGC, all those companies, what the government will ask is, give me a dividend, or give me a dividend which is more than what you will usually pay. Because I need to pay up those bills, I will start extracting money from the people who are supposed to pay me a dividend. Last year's RBI, that extraordinary dividend payout, was one such case. Now this government has done multiple other things also. For example, it has asked LIC to pay it extra dividend, it has asked ONGC to pay it extra dividend, it has asked all the oil companies which made record profits over the last 4 to 5 years, it has asked for extra payments over there. So all that money the government can come and do it. It is not an illegal method. The problem happens is, because these are public sector companies, these are supposed to be competitive companies. Now, if you take away too much money from a competitive company, they cannot invest in their own projects. So they cannot compete with private sector players, A, and part B, they cannot invest in their own research, development, technology, etc. Right? As a result of which, those companies fall behind with their private sector competitors. One of the reasons why a lot of public sector companies are not as competitive as they used to be is because, you take out too much dividends from the company. There is not enough money to invest in future projects. Your growth stagnates, you lose manpower, all those problems come up over there. So while it's not illegal to ask for money, if you keep on extracting too much money from companies, the company will not be able to grow. Now, these two are usual and largely accepted practices of managing your cash flow. I will either defer payments, or I'll go to my other people who are supposed to pay me and pay them up. Now, the other methods which are available to the government, and that is what creates a bit of problem for government in particular and the economy as a whole, is because government is such a huge enterprise. If you were to look at it, whatever it does basically affects the rest of the economy. Now let's see what are the problems which the government creates because of the other methods it's using. The first method that you can use is, if you're running a deficit, I will take a loan to pay that particular money. Right? Now, because the deficit is so huge, right? Because you have such a shortfall of revenues, right? When the government has to borrow, it has to borrow in such a huge amount, there is not enough money remaining for the other people to borrow. So this is called the crowding out effect. So when the government borrows too much from the market, there is not enough money left for the other people to borrow, for a corporate sector, etc. to borrow. Worse, because everyone expects the government to pay. Right? The government never defaults, because worst case scenario, it can print money and give it to you. Right? So when the government starts borrowing it to such an extent, there's not enough money left, and because government is the safest investor, or the safest safest person you can lend to, right? The other companies, because they have lesser amount of money, the interest rate starts rising, so it becomes more expensive for the other companies or the private companies or the private enterprises to borrow from the market. This is called the crowding out effect. The other problem which happens is that because government is borrowing in such a huge amount and government is, going to use that money to spend and, boost up the economy, the private enterprises sometimes lose incentive to actually borrow more and invest. They will say that, okay, boss, I'm making this much amount of money. I'm happy with this much amount of money because anyways the government is doing it. So they don't have any patriotic or, so to speak, the nationalistic motive to spend and develop the country as such. They will just be like happy with a smaller amount. They will also start deferring their projects. That is the second part, which that's a problem which government has if it starts borrowing too much. Right? So that is one way. That's still not as bad a problem as the other problem. Now, what do you do if you do not have money, right? But you have to pay the bills. The other resort that you use to is basically you ask your friend to pay for it or your parents to pay for it. Now, this is what the government is doing, and that's why it's hiding the budget. What the government is doing is that instead of it making a payment, it is diverting all those payments through its own subsidiaries. Some of them are not even listed. For example, the Food Corporation of India is basically paying all the subsidy bills. What was the amount of subsidy bill? 60,000 crore rupees. That is the size of subsidy bill that Food Corporation of India is actually paying. Right? Huge amount of money. It is not reflected as a deficit on the government side because it's the government's subsidy given to the farmers for fertilizers, seeds, etc., which is basically being pushed through the Food Corporation of India. Now, Food Corporation of India does not have it's not that big a size. What will it do? It will start borrowing again. Just like we said, if Food Corporation of India, everyone knows it's a government of India enterprise, and because Food Corporation of India is borrowing, it basically is going to repay its debts, right? So there is no reason not to lend to Food Corporation of India. So they will give extra loans or they will give loans at a reasonable rate to the Food Corporation of India, even though its own size may not, if it goes in a competitive market, it may not qualify for that big a loan. But because there is a government backing, Food Corporation of India gets away with getting huge loans, which it may or may not be able to repay later on, right? But it gets away with it again. Because Food Corporation India is backed by the government of India, there is also a crowding out effect because of the size of borrowings which are there. The Food Corporation of India in the last year has actually borrowed from funds which a lot of people will not even touch. To give you an example, a lot of people, you would have probably heard it from your father or mother who are going through the tax season and investing, they will tell you invest in those Kisan Vikas Patra or National Savings Scheme. Right? These are post office schemes, these are certificates which are available at post office schemes. 5 to 6 years is a lock-in period, you double your money. Right? A lot of people, a lot of small rural people, etc., put this money in this small national small saving fund. Right? Food Corporation of India has actually borrowed money from that. Right? So you're basically taking money which was supposed to be invested for poor people, and you're basically taking that money out and funding your own, subsidy bill. Right? That is one. Now, the government of India has to make payments for railways, right? All the subsidies which are given through railways, that has to be paid for by the government. So what does government of India say? Okay, it asks the transportation companies and GAIL, the gas sector companies, etc., to either give railways at a discounted rate, all the fuel, etc., at a discounted rate, or defer their payments. Right? So you are actually hurting public sector companies, their balance sheet, to make sure that your subsidies and your bills are paid or managed. Right? Because it is the size of the government, the amounts that we are talking about are huge amounts of money. Another example, you have all these power plants, right? They have to make the payment. So instead of government making the payment, they are routing it through the Power Finance Corporation. You have all these infrastructure companies or the roadways companies. They are not making the payments. Deferring those payments basically means that the road is half stuck. Your bridge is not fully built. Running a deficit and the government not able to make the payments on time, or asking somebody else to make the payment, basically hurts the economy directly. Right? That's why everyone said, like, let's make sure that the budget deficit is, or the fiscal deficit is kept at a manageable level. One resort which is available to the government and it's not available to anyone else is basically it can ask people to RBI to print money and pay off its loans. Right? I cannot create my own money and pay off a loan. Right? But the government through RBI can tell the RBI, boss, print the money and pay off all the debts which are there. Now, what happens when RBI prints money and starts pushing it through? When RBI prints money and pushes it through, it pushes up inflation directly, right? That's the normal part. I mean, if you print more money, there is a lot of money floating around, but the supply of goods remain the same. More money is chasing the same amount of goods, as a result of which the price of the goods become higher because the demand is risen. Right? So that's a simplistic way of putting why inflation rises if you print more and more money. Now, government can do it, but if you have inflation, at the same time you have low growth, and you are running fiscal deficit, and your unemployment is, going through the roof, you end up in what is called a stagflation. Right? Your economy is stagnant, but inflation is very high. Stagflation is perhaps the slowest death possible for any economy. If you look at most economics textbooks, they will tell you examples of stagflation. One of the biggest examples of stagflation was in just before Margaret Thatcher came in Britain in the late 70s, early 80s, and in America in the Nixon era, when you had inflation almost reaching 18-19%. But you can look at the history of that particular stagflation and how Paul Volcker, basically, who was the Fed Reserve chairman, managed that particular stagflation and do it. Now, one advantage that America has while printing money is that the American currency is the world's reserve currency, right? So it may not depreciate in value as much as an Indian currency will, right? So if we keep on printing money, the inflation will eat up on the value of the Indian currency. So that might be another problem, and that is one of the challenges. India just cannot print as much money as possible, just like America can do. America can get out of its problem, and it did get out of its problems multiple times by printing money. Indian government cannot do it because it's not as widely accepted as a American dollar. So these are the challenges where the government faces when it looks at the budget, especially the fiscal deficit. So that one number, that one metric basically tells you the health of the economy. And because the government wants to keep it at 3%, it starts fudging the accounts. What is the extent of fudging? The CAG report basically said that officially the government reported 3.4% as your fiscal deficit for the year 2017-18. The actual deficit was somewhere close to 5.5 to 6%, which means you're reporting only 60% of the deficit, right? Which means you're basically not showing almost half your expenses, or at least 40% of your expenses you're not even showing, right? Running 6% fiscal deficit is a huge problem because even the state governments in their own budgets will run more deficits. Okay. And because everyone knows that India is fudging its numbers, people have lost faith in what the government is reporting. Another problem, the credibility of India's numbers. Not only does the GDP number have a problem, which a lot of people realize, you also have a problem in terms of the other numbers, the associated numbers which are being reported because of all these creative management, fudging, depending on whatever you want to call it. And that basically hides the problem. It's like you're suffering from a disease, you're hiding the symptoms of the disease. You're telling everyone that, I'm pretty healthy, whereas from the inside, you're actually suffering. If you don't show and go to the doctor saying that, boss, these are the problems which I'm facing, the doctor will not be able to give you the correct medicine. He might think that you are having a mild fever, but in reality, you might be suffering from something really bad, even much worse, and he will just be giving you an aspirin or a paracetamol and ask you to go home and relax. That brings us to an end to this topic on budgetary terminology, which you can use for group discussion and interviews preparation. As I said, the aim of this was not to tell you all the problems which are there, but it's probably to tell you this type of complexities that the finance minister is going to face, and anyone who's working in the economics department in the government is actually facing. And there are no quick fixes to this. So you can probably read up more about this if you have any interest in economics. If you're going to, you're going to be doing an MBA anyways, so you can do it like a basic homework as such. And you also know what are the things not to tell in a particular interview, so as in front of an economics professor, so as to make you feel as if you are a fool. Please do like and share this on Facebook. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share this with your friends. Till we meet again the next time. Goodbye and all the best.